Be near, O God, as we contemplate these ancient words. Help us to find within them a source that pulls us away from despair and towards hope. Help us find space within the words and around them to weave our own lives, that together we might join the very stones in crying out with hope, changing the world one gospel action at a time. Bless, O God, the words of my mouth, the hearts and minds and souls of those that hear them, and will help turn them into action. Amen. It's a pretty familiar story for those who are part of the Christian tradition. Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. His arrival in one gate. Some would say, as others are coming in, the official kind of foreign dignitary gate. Because things were getting closer and closer to the Passover celebration. And so folks were showing up in droves, and the population of Jerusalem was expanding greatly as all of these other folks came to celebrate Passover. And here comes Jesus, riding on the colt of a donkey. A very different kind of entry. Yes, surrounded by his 12 disciples, if you want to think of them as like, the RCMP around Jesus, making sure nothing too bad happened. And that wouldn't be an unrealistic understanding. And as he comes in, the crowd, of course, we're told, gets more and more excited. More and more people show up, and they tear down palm branches like the ones that you have, and they place them on the ground, and they take off their cloaks, and they put them on the ground, creating their own peasant version of a red carpet. And Jesus gets challenged because that kind of unrest, that kind of power, that kind of physical presence, well, that disrupted the apple cart. That rocked the boat. And we all know what tends to happen to people who rock the boat. And so the Pharisees tell him to be quiet, to tell his followers to be quiet. And Jesus responds with that very popular phrase, "Even if I did, the stones would cry out." There's something about this quest for justice, this quest for compassion and understanding, and creating communities where no one is left behind, where no one is forgotten. Doesn't matter what their history has been, or what they've said, or done, or not said for that matter, or not done, where everyone is welcomed, included, valued, wanted, and affirmed. There's something about that kind of energy and that kind of movement that even if people were silenced, the very stones would cry out. I think as we begin our Lenten journey, and I say begin because we won't end worship today with a benediction, but just with a commissioning as we move through Holy Week and towards Good Friday and then on towards Easter before our service ends. That as we begin Holy Week, the question is, if you were one of those stones, for what would you cry out this Lenten season? What is it in your own life or in our community that you would cry out on behalf of? What have you witnessed enough of that you're prepared to say no more? Enough is enough. What is it that burns within your heart where that you're prepared to say, I'm going to do something different today? Well, you might say, well, I'll do something different tomorrow, but no later than tomorrow. It doesn't have to be a huge thing. It's not like, I'm going to sell everything off, but I'm going to make some small change. The stones weren't big. They were paving stones, right? They're small stones. They're irregular in shape in the ancient world. They're rounded, smooth because of all the feet and hooves and sandals and wagon wheels that have gone over them over hundreds of years. But each one would have cried out. Each one would have offered its voice to change the world. And I think in this moment in human history, that's a question for us this Lenten season, this beginning of Holy Week. What would we cry out, even when the world tells us to be quiet and go away and be silent? After the development of nuclear weapons and when they were tested in the Pacific on certain islands, about 15 to 20 years later, they started to show some signs of life and recovery once again. And there was an intentional effort to try and repopulate these islands with animals and different kinds of trees and shrubs and insects and all that you need to have a viable ecosystem. And through the 50s and 60s, scientists realized that lots of things were happening, but they wanted to reintroduce chimpanzees to the islands. One of the challenges was that the husks on the bananas were still radioactive. But if you washed the husk, you could clean the banana. And so they undertook this teaching exercise where they taught 10 chimpanzees how to wash their bananas before they ate them. To go to a stream, wash the banana, and then eat it and throw away the husk. It's a story called The 100th Chimpanzee. And so they had these 10 chimps trained, and they released them into the wild, and they kept an eye on things, as you would. And eventually, what they realized is that the 10 chimpanzees taught other chimpanzees, right? As learning species, they taught and learned from one another. And eventually, there was 20 chimps that were all washing their bananas in the stream. And then there was 30, and then 50, and then 90. But the problem was there was thousands of chimpanzees. And this was taking a long, long time. And the scientists noticed that something miraculous happened at about the 100th chimpanzee. All of a sudden, there was an explosion of learning in the community. And they went from 100 to thousands. And all of a sudden, it was the odd one out that wasn't washing their banana. Everybody else was picking them and going off to the stream to wash the banana before they ate it, like you would, right? But there's something about that reaching that critical mass that then kind of tips the scale and it becomes a communal movement. I think in some ways that's what Jesus is talking about, in that the stones would cry out. It starts with a small group of people. It starts with you and me. And eventually we show others what's possible by the way we live our lives. And eventually they go, well, that's actually not a bad idea. And they start to live their lives like that too. And eventually something like homelessness or poverty or the opioid crisis can be overcome. Not because some politician somewhere writes a really great speech with really great words, and not because something becomes law, but because people like you and I refuse to be silent and instead cry out like the stones in the story would have, so that we model a different way of being like the 100 chimpanzees. And in so doing, we don't just change our lives, we change the lives of others and create a community for everyone. Thanks be to God. Amen.